Oh, it's talking back. Is it supposed to talk back to me? Hello? Hello? Try again. Oh, it's still doing. No. Hello? Turn the volume. DX. Hello? Hello? All right. Thank you. Okay, no echo. Nope. Good. Okay. So my name is Todd Savitt. I teach over in the Department of Bioethics at the medical school, and have known Dr. Mallette for a number of years. So this is the second presentation of the fall 2022 season of the Medical History Interest Group lecture series. The presentations are sponsored in part by Ruth and John Moskop Lecture Series and the Lopus Library History Collections. If you haven't already done so, please sign the sign-in sheet, the registration sheet sitting right outside the wall here. And you may have spotted the refreshments in the back, also on the other side of the wall. Feel free to help yourselves. I'm going to delay the talk for 1 minute just to tell you that there are several history exhibits on display at the moment here in the library. On the 4th floor here, we have a pop-up exhibit related to today's lecture, featuring historical photographs of members of the Old North State Medical Society. We also have an exhibit called Scientists and Their Microscopes, which shows various microscopes in our collection with images of well-known scientists who use the same versions of those microscopes in their research. On the 2nd floor of the library, to commemorate 300 years since the pirate Blackbeard's adventures around North Carolina, we have an exhibit called The Plague of Piracy. The exhibit includes photos and artifacts, artifact cast replicas on loan from the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology and the Queen Anne's Revenge Lab. It is complemented with artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum. Today's presentation is slightly changed from the title that I had. As you can see up there, it's about the history of the Old North State Medical Society and hospital segregation. Our presenter is Dr. Julius Q. Mallette, Medical Director of the Behavioral Health Center of the Kinston Community Health Center. Dr. Mallette is an obstetrician gynecologist and maternal fetal medicine and addiction medicine specialist in Kinston. He lived his formative years, I guess that means he grew up in both Wilmington and Raleigh. He received his Bachelor's of Science degree in biochemistry from NC State and attended our own Brody School of Medicine when it was still called East Carolina University School of Medicine, and graduated actually the year I got here, 1982, so 40 years ago. He completed his internship and residency training at the George W. Hubbard Hospital, which is at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, and was chief resident of OBGYN here at ECU from 1984 to 1986. He also completed a subspecialty fellowship in maternal fetal medicine and human genetics at the University of Maryland. He served for a number of years as Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at Brody, and that's where I got to know him a bit. He has always had a keen interest in healthcare disparities in medical education and in community health. He has worked on programs to decrease infant mortality, especially in the region of Eastern North Carolina. As I've said, I have known Dr. Mallette for years, though our paths have not crossed as often in recent years. He was a strong student advocate during the time I knew him here at BSOM and has been a role model for many of our graduates and residents. As mentioned, he is also a strong patient advocate working to reduce racial disparities in health and healthcare. He also has an interest in something close to my heart, African American medical history, and we will see some of that today in his presentation. The role of the Old North State Medical Society during segregation in North Carolina. It was a wonderful life, or was it? I'm intrigued. Okay, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Julius Mallette.
I'm good, I think. I'm good, yeah, thank you. Well, it's really wonderful to return to the school and to be a part of the university's educational system one more time. It's been a number of years since I was here and retired the first time. My wife can say, okay, go ahead and tell me about the other retirements. But in 2007 is when I retired the first time from ECU. So I've always had a real strong heart for what happens with the school here and the students especially. And when given the opportunity to make a lecture, I said, well, let me work on a topic that would help put a good frame around the development of the medical school here. And the Old North State's role was critical for that. But during that time period, there was something else going on. And so I want to get started, if it's okay. I am a fellow of the American College of OBGYN. It's just over and over again. That's that extra O. That's what I. Let's see. Uh-oh. I didn't mean to jinx myself. Over and over. Oh, okay, here. Okay. All right. You know, that's the old school in me. That's my review. There's always something. I can just do that. Yeah. Okay. Something says got it. Rearrange the video stage. Let me X that out. You know, I was just speaking with our director here about, okay, still there, good, about some of the things that I like to say about computers. Right now, help. Okay. Oh, okay, then they'll preview. Okay. All right. So you think this will work? I'll try it. Okay. So some of the things I like to say about computers, I'm I'm not quite the poet that Dr. Best was, but I try. And so my poems are not long and eloquent, but just kind of short to the point. One of my poems that I like to say, and I actually got that from my dad, was that computers are extremely fast. Now, if only they would be that smart. The other one I'll share, since we brought up computers, is that computers are extremely methodical. Now, let me see if they can be logical, because sometimes they're just not logical, but they are very helpful. So this is a legacy lecture. I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be able to say some things and to give it in a lecture format, which is something I've enjoyed doing for many, many years. And this lecture is going to be about the Old North State Medical Society, of which I'm a member. Was part of the founding, actually helped start the Pitt County chapter named after Dr. Best. So I'm the founding president for that chapter. And the Old North State Medical Society has been around for a long time. In the 1890s or so, the exact date, who knows exactly when, but it got started when one of the founders, Dr. Moore, was giving the valedictorian address from his graduating class. And his statement was that he thought that physicians of color should really work hard to try to improve the health situation in the state of North Carolina. So it really started with their education, that's the way things really start, when people are educated. And they were educated at a wonderful school, educated a large number of African-American doctors in the state of North Carolina, the Leonard School of Medicine. I actually knew one of their graduates who Dr. Perry, was down in Fayetteville. He was one of my role models. I was a young kid. I ain't that old now, but Dr. Perry was quite an eloquent physician and a good doctor, and he was a very sharp dresser, and he had a big car. So that's all a young boy needs to see. Sharp dresser, got a big car. I want to be like Dr. Perry. And but he served the folks in the Fayetteville area for a long time and did a wonderful job. He was also part of the group of folks that developed the Hinton test, which is a test for syphilis. It's kind of archaic now, but Dr. Perry was one of the scientific doctors working on that test. So the Old North State's been involved for a long time. They've had a great record of providing physicians of color to serve all people. The lecture is not really about them, but I have to mention this, that you might say, well, where's this medical school? Well, it's still in Raleigh, and that's the building. I was there a couple of months ago and I took that picture. I said, you know, this is really something quite historic, that this medical school was here and did some of the early training of physicians. The Flessner report and all that, I'm not going to go into that, but it ended up, things didn't turn out the way they should have, but certainly not the way it ended up turning out. The Leonard School of Medicine was closed, and it was a sad day for that, but it was. And however, the structure remained, and the folks at Shaw have maintained that so that it will still be an icon for medical education as well as for uplift of people that are underserved and underrepresented. So I'm going to talk about the history of segregation in North Carolina, some about the African-American healthcare, the development of strategies to help address those needs. I'm not going to go into that. That could be a whole long lecture series, but I have to mention it. The history of the African-American hospitals in North Carolina, the Old North State Medical, and then the medical heroes in the fight for better health care in the African-American community during segregation. I want to do that so bad. Okay. And, you know, it's not quite Christmas, but this is one of my favorite Christmas movies. It's a Wonderful Life. It has so much meaning in so many different ways, and so many different conditions, and even in so many different cultures. It had one of my favorite actors too. Okay, both of them, Donna Reed as well as James Stewart from the old school. You know, I thought they were really good quality people and actresses. So it's a Wonderful Life, a movie made by Frank Capra. And it's shown every Christmas just about on television. It was made in 1947. Basically to do what's the script notes for it, I'll tell you in about 3 paragraphs. So George Bailey is a local hero in his hometown, especially for the underprivileged. And he lost money during the Great Depression, but recovered it. And unfortunately, there was a major loss because of his family. You know, I don't think there's any finger pointing, but there was a lot of discussion as to how that money was lost. And there was an individual, Mr. Potter, who was there, and he decided to take advantage of that loss. What it did was create so much pressure on George until he really decided that his life was worthless. And he had decided to take his life. Well, up pops Clarence. Now, how many of you remember Clarence? Yeah. I thought Clarence was pretty cool. He was goofy, but he was a cool guy. He thought very carefully and came up with a strategy to help George understand why his life was important. So he had the situations around him change such that he would get to see what the world would be like without him. Not just once he was a banker, but even as a child. So that part of that movie always struck me and made me think, okay, so that's really something that each of us should look back on and say, you know, I'm important. You know, you don't want to be, you know, conceited or anything, but you are important. And as a biochemist, I can tell you, it takes a lot of electrons to make your brain work. And not only that, if you could convert it into money, it's over billions and billions of dollars in each of you. And because of that, that movie kind of strikes with me to recognize everybody is important. Now, what he did was said, George, if you hadn't lived, there would be a lot of people that wouldn't reach their potential. Not only that, they may not even survive. If you remember the movie, his brother wasn't there. He didn't save all those soldiers during World War II because he never existed, because George didn't save his life. Nearly the whole town was affected in this scenario. And I thought about that in connecting the role of the Old North State and what they did during a time that was really a tough time, the time of segregation. And they were a part of a group of doctors, all trained, all certified, if you will, that practice. And they were able to help address some of these healthcare disparities during that time. And during that time, the biggest healthcare disparity that came about was related to the first pandemic in this country. And they addressed that pandemic by setting up healthcare facilities, assisting with all the roles that the government played in trying to help people survive the first flu. I'm not going to call it the Spanish flu because I don't think that's fair. And what I've gained over my reading is that it really didn't have anything to do with Spain. But you know what I'm talking about if I use that term. So all that happened in A Wonderful Life in the year 1947. Well, they started making the movie in 46, but it really started coming out and being seen all over the country. It was a big hit in 1947. 1947 was a wonderful year for A Wonderful Life. World War II had ended with the victory of the Allied countries. There were veterans coming home with great expectations. President Truman had made a major move by releasing Secure These Rights, which is his executive statement saying the military would be desegregated. unfortunately, some things kept African Americans from having a wonderful life. One of those was racial terrorism, lynching. It did occur in North Carolina. Segregation and multiple arenas of disenfranchisement continued. I ran across this was in the News Observer from the Equal Justice Initiative, and it showed where down east, my home, you guys is home now. If you're not from here, you're here. So like me, I tried to get away, but kept coming back. So you're home. Here in our home, there was some horrible things happening in some counties we're all familiar with. Well, that was between 1877 and 1950. 47's included in that. So what was segregation? It was a forced separation of races of people for social, economic, educational, political, and cultural oppression. Now, it didn't just appear overnight. So I don't think it would be fair to say all of a sudden folks said we need to oppress people socially, economically, educationally, politically, or culturally. But over time, things began to develop. There were rulings, Supreme Court rulings, there were actions by groups that, were probably thinking that the people they wanted to suppress were the reasons for their problems, but not really. But the culture from centuries made it an easy scapegoat to say, this person, because of their race, they're the reason why you don't have a super duper farm. But at any rate, all that continued to grow and develop such that it created a system and was called segregation. Well, I remember this. Like I said, I grew up in Wilmington and Raleigh. And by the time I moved to Raleigh, the fountains were still there, but they had taken the signs down. But in Wilmington, I remember the signs. So it was real. It wasn't something that was made up. And this photo shows that. So everything was segregated: housing, schools, colleges, businesses, healthcare, even doctors' offices. I remember that too. My pediatrician was a wonderful pediatrician. He probably saved my eyesight because he diagnosed when I was a young kid a form of measles encephalitis. And I don't know all the things he did for his care, but one thing I did appreciate, he made me wear some cool looking shades. I guess so that I wouldn't have the photo damage on my retina. But Dr. Frank Reynolds, he did that. But Dr. Frank Reynolds was a great man. I saw they had given him some accolades. I wish I had got to know him in this role. But his office was segregated. In fact, as a kid, I walked in the office, I said, hey, kids don't get sick. I couldn't quite catch that. But it didn't matter too much because he made me feel better. And when I left, I got a lollipop. So I said, well, I hope they get a lollipop because he gave us one. But it was real. In 1947, it was an unyielding law in North Carolina. Now, in 1955, there was a hospital in Bamberg, South Carolina, that was segregated. There was a baby born in the basement of that segregated hospital. And my mother told me stories about that. She said the doctor was a nice man, but that's all she could say. The experience wasn't that great. In fact, my dad told me the story about how I was born at a time when segregation was very strong. In fact, that same year, Emmett Till had been murdered. And that as a baby, my bassinet was placed in the corner of the nursery after they took me from the basement put me in the corner of the nursery, but she only had one nursery. And my dad was really upset about that because he was a World War II veteran, and he had served very, very well in Pearl Harbor, actually. After the bombing, he was sent there and was part of the hospital corps to help provide services for the soldiers and people that were injured. So he was upset. And of course, that's my dad. And that little guy with a bottle in his mouth, that's me. But it was real. It was a part of the life that we led. So a part of that history of segregation, there was this fallacy that really came about because of a Supreme Court ruling. But it said that separate but equal was acceptable. But we all knew that was a fallacy. It wasn't designed to work. But there were strategic moves with that, such that land grant colleges got funding from the government. And because of that, then they were saying, well, we're trying to make it equal, so we're giving money. Well, a lot of great schools came out of land grant colleges. One I went to, North Carolina State. One my dad went to. My wife, my family got a lot of folks from there, North Carolina A&T State University. So the strategy was to utilize what was there to try to get what was going to be good. But it was still a fallacy because separate but equal is not something that's real. Until 1954, when the board, Brown versus the Board of Education, that case disproved that separate was equal. It wasn't dismantled, however, without a lot of resistance. And many Black physicians were at the forefront to replace the fallacy with fairness. So how did it end? Well, it didn't end until there were many political and economic forces that, through many different allies, changed it. People that saw it was not right. And they started working towards it, making a difference. And Old North State was a part of that. You all know the heroes that I mentioned here. One that's just becoming really more known is Harry Truman. Some of the things that he did to really help end segregation. And of course, we know about Dr. John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson. There were organized groups to help support and fight the oppression placed on African Americans post-Reconstruction, like the NAACP. And most activity in North Carolina centered around schools and churches. Sit-ins, North Carolina A&T. Sit-ins, North Carolina Central University now. Other schools, Shaw University had a major sit-in that they talk about sometimes. My wife is from Raleigh. She remembers very distinctly the students sitting on Wilmington Street and blocking the traffic for folks to kind of pay attention. We want to make sure you're heard, or that you hear what we're saying, that this fallacy needs to change. And protests came from a lot of celebrities. I couldn't begin to name them all, but some you may or may not know were helping to protest to develop a fairer society. Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, Charleston Heston. I didn't really know that, but he was a part of that. Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, all the Nat King Cole. I could just go on and on and on. So it didn't just happen because people were disgruntled and decided to protest. There were protests, but those protests came from the social and the economic strategies that helped to make a difference. So for nearly 100 years, the law of the land in North Carolina in particular was segregation. That's the act that was passed by Congress to provide the funding for the land grant colleges to create the separate but equal situation. And although after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it was considered illegal to have separatism in North Carolina, however, things didn't change immediately. They didn't. In 1966, I moved to Raleigh from Wilmington, and I remember very distinctly seeing billboards with the Klans on a horse. Welcome to Klan country. As a kid, I was like, oh, that's a crazy looking horse you on. But I knew that that was problems. My dad was a grad student in genetics at North Carolina State. And he was doing quite well in it. But I remember coming up to visit him one time, and the students were carrying a Confederate flag much bigger than this screen, running down the campus, talking about things that they wanted. I didn't understand what they were saying. I was about 8 or 9 years old, but I do remember that scene. And I said, oh my goodness, that's a problem. I'm not going to go into too much of the Supreme Court issues, but I think in today's world, it's important to recognize that there are institutions within our society, our government, that can make a difference. And it really is important that people are educated enough to recognize that that difference can be either good or bad. And we want to keep it good. So I just thought I would make sure you understand that that history didn't just appear. It took strategies. It took folks that were there making a difference. And some of those folks were part of the Old North State Medical Society. There's a doctor in Rocky Mount. He's still with us. He was actually the first person to do a sit-in in North Carolina. He was doing a sit-in at a Durham cafe. And, you know, there's always a historical figure that nobody doesn't find out about till later. But Dr. Avant did that. And finally, WRAL, maybe 3 years ago, did a piece on him. But he was a member of the Old North State Medical Society and a friend of mine. He's a retired OBG. And he was really important in just setting the tone, because he actually took those folks to the Supreme Court. He was his own lawyer, and he won. So then that gave a lot of impetus to others to say, well, you know, what the Supreme Court says, we can eat where we want to, then we should try it too. George Simpkins, Alvin Bunt. Dr. Simpkins was a dentist. At that time, the Old North State Medical Society was both medical and dental. They were the ones that sued Moses Cone Hospital. Y'all heard of Moses Cone, Greensboro? They sued them so that they could have privileges there. Now, one of the things that happened with the hospitals in North Carolina during that time, they didn't deny Black patients, but they did put them in separate wards, including our hospital here. Personal experience with one of the nurses that worked in those separate wards was a good friend of our family, Ms. Ernestine Hasselrick. So we know that it was real. But when they sued them, then that set the tone for others to follow. Now, Dr. Eaton and Dr. Rohn and Dr. Gray, I knew all of them. I did not know Dr. Rohn, but I knew his daughter, I think. Maybe she was his niece. She was one of our medical students here. So I was really proud when I saw that. I said, oh, okay. But they were the first to sue in in North Carolina, but they didn't win because the Supreme Court couldn't say that that hospital would come under the ruling because it was private. It was also a ruling that if you had a private institution, you didn't have to abide by, you know, the Civil Rights Act. So you could kind of play that game, which was a bad game. But Dr. Simpkins and Dr. Blunt came back and made a difference with that. So how did segregation affect healthcare in North Carolina? Well, in the African American community, even now, there were lay healers, midwives, early physician practitioners that had trained at schools throughout the South, Dr. Savick can tell you about some of the other schools that were there, Knoxville, some of the other places. But there were just a few hospitals that were developed specifically to provide health care for African Americans, but they accepted all patients, but in particular for African Americans. There's St. Agnes in Raleigh, Lincoln Hospital in Durham, Wilmington Community Hospital in Wilmington, and Cherry Hospital in Goldsboro. That's our region, okay? This is where these hospitals were set up. And there were other hospitals, though. They're not here now, but there was Good Shepherd in New Bern, Mercy Hospital in Wilson. Of course, St. Agnes is no longer functional. Wilmington Hospital is no longer functional, no longer there. Wilmington Hospital, I can say a little bit more about that because that was one of the hospitals where my dad taught nurses. And it was an impetus for me to go into medicine because I got to hear him talk to them about all the different things related to healthcare and to see them. But there were hospitals that were segregated, and you can see the number of beds for African Americans that were designated in each of those hospitals. Beaufort County, Brunswick, Craven, Columbus, Edgecombe, Lenoir, Nash, New Hanover, Onslow, Pasquotank, Pitt, Terrell, Wayne, and Wilson County Hospital. What's really special about those hospitals is that this is a picture of St. Agnes I found before it had undergone all of the changes because of weather and time. This is Wilmington Community Hospital. I remember that one because I used to go there as a kid and watch my dad teach. Lincoln Hospital in Durham, still functional, but not as a hospital, but as a clinic. My grandmother was a nurse who trained at Lincoln Hospital. And then Cherry Hospital. I couldn't find a picture of the old Cherry Hospital. Cherry Hospital is still in existence, but I did find the state marker, and it was set up as early as 1959 and has been integrated since Civil Rights Act. The reason why there were so many hospitals that had beds for African Americans was because of the Hill-Burton Act. The Hill-Burton Act followed World War II. It helped to support the country on its recovery, to support veterans and their health. Veteran health had been certainly affected by the war, but pre-war there was a draft, and the draft had the indication that if you didn't have a certain health standard, you could not go into the military. The Hill-Burton Act was in response to that, to basically increase the standard of health of folks in the country, because it would give an opportunity for secondary health care for veterans and their families. How many of you ever heard of Governor Melvin Broughton? No, some have. Yeah, yeah. I was going to say because I would graduate from Broughton High School too. Yeah, but Governor Broughton was quite a progressive integrator thinking person. He was the one who set up, following the draft data that said North Carolinians are unhealthy. He said, let's set up a healthcare commission from the state. They may have some data here in the library on that, but that was one of his major roles. And by doing so, he also selected a Black doctor to be not just a part of that commission, but to help head it up. And that was Dr. James Battle. Sorry, age again, hit the wrong button. So who was Dr. Battle? Well, he went to Lenoir, was Old North State Medical Society president. He practiced here in Greenville, starting in 1910. Mostly practiced out of his home on West 4th Street, but he had privileges at Pitt and at St. Agnes. He was recognized by Dr. Broughton as a excellent physician. That's his picture. So Dr. Battle. And that's his home on West 4th Street. Now, some of you may know that home as the home of Dr. Best. Yes, that's Dr. Best's home too. So it's kind of amazing that, maybe not too amazing, because I knew banking, financing, and all that probably made it such that the whole North State member said, okay, this is what my family will sell you this home for. Because Dr. Best came here in 55, I think. Was it 55 or 50? 54? And Dr. Battle died in 53. So it was a family decision that Dr. Best could buy the home. So to kind of sum up a little bit, what is good health care? Well, it's the utilization of skillful, medicinal, surgical techniques with compassion as a means of providing human beings the opportunity to reach their physical, emotional, and spiritual potential. That's my quote. I've practiced for 40 years, and that's what I've seen, that you really have to be very comprehensive if you're going to provide good health. It's not just writing a prescription and giving a pill. Any profession of medicine must have that education to develop in that field, to continue in education, to maintain literacy and skillful training for people that are coming forward after you've moved on, and a means of self-policing to assure safe and effective utility of the healthcare. That's what the Society of Medicine did, and that's what the North State did. The segregation system did adversely affect those, but it didn't destroy those who were trying to make a difference. And despite this disruption in comprehensive care, there was good health care provided by many of the African American physicians and allied physicians who were there to help by getting those skills, compassion, and training, and by uncompromising that acquisition in a very diligent way. Lenard School of Medicine had, as its professors, allied physicians, white physicians in the Raleigh, I think even in Chapel Hill area, that would teach those students. And they were well intent on making sure they were very strong students, very strong doctors. So now I'm just going to give a partial list of the doctors that were working in hospitals to desegregate the hospitals in this part of North Carolina. And this includes the white physicians who also took care of Black patients and were allies in the fight against segregation, oppression in healthcare. Dr. John K. Sr., Dr. Hubert Eaton, Dr. Leroy Upperman, Dr. Gray, and Dr. Frank Reynolds. I know his office was segregated, but he provided good care. And of course, the others worked hard. I knew Dr. Eden and Dr. Upperman. He was a childhood hero of mine, too. He had a Jaguar. That was all I needed to see. Dr. James Slade in Edenton. Any of you ever heard of Dr. Slade? Well, I can tell you, Dr. Slade's well known because he was recognized by Oprah as a doctor who did house calls and worked very diligently for his patients. And one of his patients wrote Oprah and said that he had an old car. And Oprah, like Oprah does, went and bought him a car. And they had a big to-do in Edenton about that. Dr. Avant, I told you about him. Dr. James Bryant was also the first African-American to have privileges at Nash Hospital. And he's no longer with us, but he was there in Rocky Mount making a difference. Dr. Robert McDowell and Dr. George Dednam in Raleigh area, I knew both of them well. They provided good care for me, and they had all kinds of skills. One thing about Dr. McDowell, when the hospitals desegregated, he couldn't get privileges in what he did at St. Agnes. He was a surgeon. And that still kind of said, okay, there's still some things hanging on, not making it totally fair. But he was an excellent family physician. Dr. Middleton is female, who provided care for folks like my wife when she was in childhood. And Dr. Rose Pulley, I don't know if y'all remember Dr. Pulley. Dr. Pulley was part of the battle too. And she was so unassuming, you would never know that. But Dr. Pulley worked hard to help desegregate the hospitals and provided very good care for African Americans. Of course, Dr. Hannibal was African American physician, and Dr. Sidney Barnwell in New Bern, and Dr. Alvin Blunt, Dr. Simpkins in Greensboro. I consider these as our angels without wings. And at this time, I'd like to give them an applause. I know they're not here with you. And I'd like to give them their wings because they did quite a bit for us. And we are very thankful that they made a difference. The angels without wings, though, that I have to mention, especially here, are the ones that affected us the most right here in Greenville and the East. Dr. Andrew Best, Dr. Maylene Irons, Dr. Sam Menges. Yeah, the Pepsi Cola people. They desegregated Pitt County Hospital without a court order. Some of you know the story, some don't, but I'll repeat it. Dr. Best delivered babies. Dr. Irons took care of them. They were friends. And they decided, let's stop this. You deliver a baby, bring it to the nursery, I'll take care of it. I spoke personally, I did not get to speak with Dr. Irons, but Dr. Best and I talked a lot. And he told me about that story, wherein when the baby was born, he took the baby up the stairs because babies were born in the basement, and they went into the nursery. Of course, there was a lot of response that wasn't favorable. And they threatened to take the privileges of Dr. Best. They didn't threaten Dr. Irons, but I'm sure they were thinking it. And they went to then Dr. Menges, who was the surgeon and chief of staff of Pitt Hospital, and said, we've done this. What you gonna do? Dr. Menges thought for a while and said, well, we're gonna do what you said was best. And hence the hospital here was integrated by two doctors that were courageous. I do feel that, yes, I do feel that one day we need to make a monument for that act. It was extremely courageous and made a difference in our community. Dr. Weaver in Ahoskie, another angel without wings, providing services for folks in that part of the state. Dr. Milton Quiglis, who even went as far as developing his own small hospital out of his office. And I think that building is still there today in Tarboro. And Dr. Sidney Barnwell, whom we're so blessed to have him with us. He's well in his 90s, and but he still practices. He was at the health department the last time I checked. But Dr. Barnwell, yeah. Dr. Barnwell was an excellent surgeon, sort of a role model for those of us that wanted to do surgery. And he was a part of the faculty at ECU in the very early days. As a student, I used to drive my Pinto down to New Bern so I could watch Dr. Barnwell do autopsies and educate us on medicine and surgery. So he played a major role. So it was a wonderful life. Eventually, it's still developing. But every time the bell rings, an angel gets their wings. And I can hear Jimmy Stewart now, if he was here, say, that's right, way to go, doctors. Now, the piece with the North Carolina Old North State Society, Old North State Medical Society, was that we wanted to continue that continuum of education to provide services for the underprivileged, for the underrepresented, for the disenfranchised. And they were able to do so. We've given them their wings, so I won't go back to that. But you can anytime you want to. Our care had the demographics that said there was a need, and we all know the poverty indicators for Eastern North Carolina. The community and institutional care that the Old North State members helped to set up while they were working in the segregated hospitals, they wanted to see if they could help support this medical school. Some of you don't know, but the Old North State was the only medical society to support development of the East Carolina University School, now Brody School of Medicine. Legislative budget, and when I was senior associate dean, I was up at the legislature a lot because I had to report that we were carrying out their mission. And I did see in writing very plainly $75 million for Dr. Hayek's. And those of you who've been here around, you remember Dr. Hayek, right? I do too. So when I saw his name, I went, oh, Dr. Hayek. Dr. Hayek was our dean. He was the dean of everything. He was a great man. But he was the one who actually went to the legislature and said, we need a medical school here. And if those of you remember him, he was quite a convincing person. He convinced them to give $75 million. But he couldn't do that unless our other angels were there. It made a big difference. Couldn't mention ECU School of Medicine without mentioning Dr. Leo Jenkins. He decided to take the tiger by the tail. And no matter what people were telling him, we need a medical school here. I did get to see Dr. Jenkins before he died, and I remember seeing him as a student because I came in the first group, and we met with him on a regular basis. And so he would tell us the mission, the story, why we needed to work hard and all that. He was quite an inspirational person. So I did get to see him. He was on a stretcher coming from some procedure or something, and I was full garb doctor, and I told him, I just want to tell you thank you for being a bear, for not standing down when people said, we don't need you. We don't need that. Another angel without wings, Chief Justice Harry Pry. Chief Justice was there in the committee, and there was a tie vote, and he hadn't voted. But he used his power to put in the mission of the school those things that the Old North State wanted to see present. He broke the tie. And of course, Dr. Best. And in 1947, when this movie came out, he had just finished a tour of duty. But I'm glad that he made it through and came and practiced and worked and went to med school and tried to make a difference. So thus we have this mission for our school, to increase minority doctors, increase primary care, and increase rural health service. That came about because of our angels, but also because of other people in the area too. And they were the ones who fought. It was a joint effort. It was like the community that came back to get George out of debt. Those of you who remember the movie, there were all kinds of people in his living room putting money in the hat, saying, we love you, George. We don't want you to go broke. Everybody made a difference in developing this school because it made a difference in the people. And I couldn't go without saying the Brody family and their ability to help finance all that. And because they did, it also happened as well. Okay, so I just pushed this and you can kind of see some of the things that were happening. This was right after Floyd. But one of the other members, how do I get the volume up? Yep, stop. Come, tell me, please. Okay, I'll go back. Oh. Okay, it was on. Okay. You can go ahead. Mm, mm, okay. Okay. Mm. Is this the volume? Mm. Mhm. Mm. Yeah, yeah, please. It takes a team. Yeah, so- Can y'all hear it okay? So that was the ground. That was the groundwork. People got started. Run over this way. And they worked together. Segregation is still being fought on different arenas. But because the Old North State lived, we now have a school that's nationally and internationally known, as well as a hospital that provided the care for a lot of people. Thank you. Any questions? No questions. Okay. Hey. Hi. My library friend.
I'll bring the microphone around. Not so much a question as a comment. I'm from Detroit, and my mother viewed segregation when she would come down to Nashville, Tennessee to visit her relatives. So when we went from Detroit to Nashville,
Hold 1 second. Can we somehow, let's just cut it off, I guess. Go ahead.
so when we went from Detroit to Nashville, Tennessee, to visit relatives, first time I'd been there, I was in 1964. I'm just a couple of years older than you are, Dr. Mallette. There was this huge billboard that said, "Impeach Earl Warren." And I think I might have been old enough, because I would have been 11, I think, to have known that Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time.
Exactly.
But I certainly didn't know what impeach was. But what it was referring to is all of the decisions made by the Supreme Court involving segregation. And it was the Warren Court because Earl Warren was the person in charge. So although I don't remember seeing signs for segregation in Nashville when I visited, they might have been there and I just don't remember them or wasn't in proper areas to see them. But my mother remembers going from Detroit to Nashville, changing in Cincinnati or Louisville, maybe both. And the mixed cars on the railroad, when you get to Cincinnati or Louisville, suddenly they became segregated with sections, and this would have been in the 30s and 40s, sections for whites and sections for what was called then probably colored. So although I don't remember it myself, I certainly remember that big bill. I don't remember segregation myself. I certainly remember that big billboard that I had to have my parents explain to me.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It must have been tough for your parents to explain that. Yeah. It was tough for my parents too. Any other questions? Mhm.
With us virtually today. Feel free to add questions to the chat too.
This question comes from Phoebe. She says, does Dr. Mallette have a comment on the members of the ONSMS involvement with the National Negro Health Week activities?
National Negro Health Week. Not actually, I have to be honest, I'm not familiar with that. Health Week.
Yes.
No, but would like to learn more and certainly would want to be supportive. However, I do think that just like history works with nomenclature over time. And probably if they became a little more modern and recognized ethnicity rather than an old Spanish term that could be considered derogatory. But I would be happy to, certainly support that personally. And when I learn more about it, I would certainly want to talk to the group.
Thank you, Dr. Mallette, for that wonderful insight on the history. My question is, how much of this history do our new medical students that come into Brody now hear? Do they hear what the progress, is this taught or shared with them? Because I know we only know our history if the story is told. And so my question is the story being lost as we bring in new medical students, or is this a story that's constantly being shared so they know about the history and the struggle that has gotten to this point?
Excellent question. I would say that this is the pioneer stage. Even though personally, every time I speak with students, I try to help them help them recall in their learning why they're here. And I mean, all the students. When I was dean of the student associate dean for student affairs, and I would get a chance to speak with students at the beginning of the year, I shared with them that every student, at least back then, statistics said every student is responsible for 2,500 people in their community. Now, in that 2,500, there will be some diversity. And there will be people of different backgrounds and, different races and different religions. And so you need to be prepared to take care of your flock. And because of that, this history is critical. It gives you a little more reason to understand why you can take care of your flock. Because when they were forming the school, that was part of the mission. Now, I don't know where that is now. I hope that it will be continued. I'm certainly grateful that we've gotten the idea to do this kind of recording. I hope there'll be others to come and give their side and their perspective on it. But that's a good point. Maybe Dr. Savitt can give more comment.
So I'm not sure exactly what goes on during orientation week, except Dr. Irons, the son of Dr. Maylene Irons, takes all of the medical students through West Greenville and gives them a tour of that area and the needs that are there and the needs that the medical school can provide, and also gives a bit of a background because his mom was involved with the founding of the school. It's an informal kind of thing. I don't think there is a formal, to answer your question, a formal presentation of the history of the medical school that includes a discussion about Dr. Best.
Yeah. I am retired, but if that's an invitation to come back and do something else, I would definitely consider it. Yes, sir.
How do you think the integration of hospitals and medical facilities enhance medical care or enhanced medical care at that time? I guess speak to that, versus it being separate and medical doctors seeing, certain types of illnesses or diseases, but when it all came together, do you feel that enhanced medical care overall?
I absolutely do. However, I think it has to be clear as to why. When I talk to the students, and again, another one of those orientation times, getting ready to go into the wards, I've tried to make it clear to them that your colleagues are just that, they're your colleagues. And if you're in the hallway and they call code blue, I don't know if they say that anymore now, television's kind of, use that term so much. You need to be able to look to the right and to the left. If you see a colleague, does not matter what their color, race, sex, gender is, are they going to be able to help you in doing your job? And that's why systematically we need to make sure that there's a continuum of integration, diversity, training, and students and faculty. When I was here working with the accreditation of the med school, which was blessed to have such wonderful faculty and people, we all went through that, flying colors, but it was because of their commitment to the mission. Now, hospital care itself, as you know, is expensive. That expense occurs because we want the best. We should get the best. That is something, the best equipment, the best training and motivation, that really depends on the individual as far as physicians. But, I could really be so motivated and so highly skilled with a hammer. But if I had a chainsaw, I could really get that tree down. You follow what I'm saying? So having the equipment in some of the facilities that weren't there in the segregated hospitals makes a difference. And that will continue to make a difference. It doesn't mean there wasn't good care. That's what I really wanted to point out in that paragraph, that there was good care because people cared. I know my doctors did. And they would come by and talk, and I could sit in there and they'd talk for a while and ask me, how you doing? Everybody called me Quentin in Raleigh. So they say, how you doing, Quentin? Still want to go into medicine? These were people that were mentors and friends, but their commitment was amazing. Hours, the times, you could go to Dr. Dednam's office and you see patients lined up. They start at 8 o'clock. And I know I was with Dr. Dednam one time and he was so busy. He had his meal here. His family came, brought him his food. He'd take a couple of bites, go see a patient. He'd come back out, take a couple of bites, go see a patient. That kind of dedication, you can't pay for that. But you can sure pay to make sure there's a good CAT scan that works well for people that you're trying to make a diagnosis. So yes, it does make a difference. Any other questions? Got one.
This isn't so much a question, just a note that someone had during the presentation. They would like to add that there would be no Brown Hill Cemetery without Dr. Battle advocating for the needs of Black people. That was just an addition.
Nice.
I'll just put in a plug and in partial answer also to your question. The Student National Medical Association, the SNMA, invited me to speak on Wednesday about a talk that I give called Entering a White Profession, Black Physicians at the Turn of the 20th Century, so 1890s and early 1900s. But it's random, just because I got invited once. So those students will hear something about the history, not necessarily about the school, but the issues that African-American physicians did and perhaps still do face. But there is no organized, systematic education in the way that I think you're asking about.
Always have a story, how things continue, and that's all, you get stories. And just listening to Dr. Mallette, wait for the students come in. And students are so excited, they don't know how hard everybody worked to get to this place. think they would appreciate that and probably value.
You may remember, it used to be Dr. Best himself would come
Mm-hmm.
during orientation or shortly thereafter
Mm-hmm.
and talk about his
Yeah.
role and not just his role, but
Right.
the school.
Founding the school. Yeah. Yeah. I have to bring forth my wife because she, in the School of Nursing, they have a program they call windshield surveying. And the windshield survey is part of their curriculum. And they learn about the people they're going to be serving, what that community is made of, who the people are. And I think that would be one way to make certain that there's something ongoing, just to have it in the curriculum where you're learning about the people you're serving, but also about the history and why we're here. So she may want to add a comment on it, but
I just
she
wanted
wasn't
to
expecting.
that Ms. Bridges, who asked the history question, is actually the one who created the Black History program at the College of Nursing. So definitely believes in history and telling the story and keeping the story going. So she's very committed to that. And yes.
Okay. All right. Any other? One more. Okay. One more virtual.
This question has come in. Do you have any knowledge on the history of midwives and how their role has changed over time during segregation?
I only have just small snippets of info. I work with midwives. In fact, we have one right now that I worked with for years. Yeah, it's Becky Bagley, and I do know of some African American midwives that practice. Um, there was one in Pitt County. I remember a lady by the name of Miss Daniels. I don't know if y'all knew her or heard of her, but she delivered a lot of babies in this area. Um, I don't recall that history that clearly to make a significant comment, but they played a role. Yeah.
There were actually a very large number of Black midwives in the whole United States, but right here in Pitt County, I mean, there were hundreds of them. And it was in, I hate to say this, but Mary Breckenridge was a white midwife who was the daughter of a granddaughter of the Vice President of the United States. And she was a public health nurse who went to England to get trained as a midwife. And she came back and felt it important that public health nurses become trained as midwives and go out in rural areas and provide service. But she also felt that it was extremely important to have education. And so these Black granny midwives is what they called them, didn't have the education. They couldn't afford the education. It was more of an apprenticeship. But they knew the community, and that was the big thing, is when you know the community and you know the people, you know what it is they need. They were really able to provide a wonderful service for not only the Black population, but women on plantations too. The white women, they were delivering their babies. And I hate to say it was all Mary Breckenridge. I'm sure there was others too, but they did away with them and got rid of all of the Black midwives. And there were a few schools that were around, but it takes money to do that, and there just wasn't the money to provide that. So many of the Black midwives, well, all of the old granny midwives is what they called them, disappeared. The medical society had a piece to do with that too. So we're trying to bring them back, and I'm the director of the midwifery education program, the only one in North Carolina here at ECU, and we are working very hard to increase diversity in our program. And I think we're doing okay. We're still have lots of ways to go, but we're getting there. But yeah, it's really a shame what happened to the Black midwives in our country.
And I'll just add one more note. There are images in ECU's digital collections of the Black midwives from Greenville specifically. So if you are interested in seeing those images for those
here and online. If you go to ECU, just Google ECU digital collections, you can search midwives and you'll see several images of them there.
Okay. All
Any
right.
more questions? Okay, then I'll go ahead and close it out. And thank you, Dr. Mallette, for coming and speaking to me. And thank you for all of you for joining us here in person and online.
Right. Thank you.
And if you haven't signed in, please make sure you enjoy some refreshments. Take some.
All right.
Good job, man.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
National Negro Health Week, 1915 to 1951.